Welcome back to the Live by Heart Today show number 83. This is a show designed to help you navigate change, uncertainty, and the world we found ourselves in. We'll talk a little bit about science. We'll talk a little bit about how our body works, a little bit about intuition, and we talk a lot about transformation.
Live by Heart Today is brought to you by
wearehistorically.com. Conscious Human Apparel.
Raise your vibration and energize your life with specialized Fibonacci tuning forks that deepen meditations and empower self-healing. Get your vibrational sound tools for personal enhancement at energybodytuners.com.
Hello, I'm Dawn Spiegelberg, medical intuitive and coherence coach. This is a show in our pilgrimage series, and today's theme is language of the heart. With me for today's Heart to Heart is my wonderful guest, Dr. Walter, a homeopath and founder of Biofocusing, which I'm particularly interested in. Hello, Walter. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks. Good to be here.
I so appreciate it. With regard to our show's theme of heart language, I'd love to get a little insight from you about what that may mean to you and what you've come to understand it to be, because we often think of language as the things that we speak using our mouth, which is directed from our mind, our thoughts, our brains. And so in thinking about the heart having a language, how does that work? Because most of us don't think of our heart being connected to our voice.
Okay, I'd like to do a disclaimer first of all.
Yeah, let's hear it.
That is just to demote myself totally away from any notion of being a guru on this. I'm simply going to say what I've experienced, what I've learned, but it's a seriously deep and wide subject, talking about the language of the heart. And I want to point out that although I might speak with a certain amount of vehemence from time to time, my attitude here is one of humility, because I don't believe that one can be anything else. So I'd like to get that straight from the beginning and say that that this is from my personal point of view, and I don't aim to tell anyone what their heart is about. And I think that's an important disclaimer to make at the beginning.
That's really well spoken. And who knows the heart of another person?
Yeah, this is not so easy.
Yeah.
So I'm talking about what I've learned and what I sense to be the heart's language.
Mm-hmm.
So anyone who is participating in this presentation should be paying less attention to what I'm saying and merely use it as triggers to examine what their experience could be saying to them.
And I often think that we are attracted to young children, infants. And of course, infants are pre-verbal. They're not speaking with their voice. They're not using their brain to formulate words and ideas. And I think of them as communicating with their heart, solely with their heart.
Yeah. Language in itself formalizes us. And I think the heart does not go along with the formalization of anything. It depends on spontaneous expression, and it's the readability and the communicability of that spontaneous expression that we want to take a closer look at, because it seems to me that it's there all the time, and because we are trained away from it rather than made open to it, we miss what it says. It's just not part of our adult repertoire very easily, because our adult repertoire tends to formalize us more than it assists us in gaining access to that spontaneous communication, which comes from the heart rather than the verbal stuff.
This reminds me that I studied just basics of what Freud presented, and the idea that the id is just based in desire, right, and instinct. which is also pre-verbal, right? The more animalistic. And as we develop, as we become 2 and 3 years old, then the ego begins. And then by the time we're 5, that super ego, which is morality and, ethics and relating to our parents. And so in thinking about the language of the heart and superimposing it on Freud's work, you can see how it can be so easily lost by the time a child begins kindergarten or the school years, because of the way we develop and how our personality gets shifted from one of openness and innocence.
Formality tends to kill us off. We can't do without it. We need to be able to speak. And I can't remember if I've said this before, but it's quite noteworthy that the brain, out of all its myriads of possibilities, actually chose to create language. And that would have been a group effort, not a singular effort. Because language is coded communication between individuals, and in the end it boils down to group compliance. Unless you get the philosophers and the poets who dare to speak out, and some of the priests as well, who dare to speak out against the group speak, because there's something prompting them to say more than the given. And obviously they use words to communicate that, but the genesis of that, the impulse of that, the heartfeltness of that becomes an imperative. Well, it's felt as an imperative, and therefore they express what that imperative says at their own peril. This takes us down paths of newness, paths of creativity, paths of social regeneration, all these things. So when I've got a great big thing that hangs on my front door, which says, "When the heart speaks, take good note." So part of the question then becomes, how do you know when the heart is speaking rather than listening to human babble? And that's not an easy one to answer, but I think it is answerable.
You mentioned poets going against the grain a little bit, and poetry. I see poetry as a gift, although many would completely disagree with that. And you have experience with poetry. Would you talk with us a little bit about that? How you express poetry and aspects of poetry in your work?
Okay, that's quite an involved one. I began writing poetry when I was 6, and I even made a little book which I stitched together. It was fun. But I started writing poetry seriously. I dabbled a bit in my teenage years, but I started writing poetry seriously when I began my teaching career, and I had the good fortune to be pushed towards a man who was called Ridley Beaton, and he was teaching English at a university in South Africa, and he had the kindness to rip my poetry apart. And to show me that what I was saying was basically worthless unless I meant it from the heart and I tuned it by editing it. It was a ruthless exercise, and one which literally cut to the heart. And I am very, very grateful for it, because I learned in 2 poems flat how to lose the sense of ego with poetry and how to listen to the heart. And the language of the heart is valuable and deserves to be treated with as much respect as possible, and that's where editing comes in. So when someone's written a poem and they're all precious about it and they don't want to change anything, they just want it to be admired as it is, this is not yet poetry, not in its better sense. Obviously, you don't want to discourage people, but I do encourage ruthless editing as a way of getting to what the heart is actually saying. Because, I mean, what he did, he just took a red pen and put it through a poem, and he says, "Sorry, there's nothing going on over here." And then there were a couple of ticks next to words, next to sentences, and maybe something can be saved here, which really got one's thinking mind into the attitude of saying, "Oh, what's happening here? Let me pay better attention." And in that paying of better attention to your words, you learn to pay better attention to where they are coming from. Because language is a holistic thing. As I'm speaking now, I'm hopefully speaking from a sense of purpose, and I'm hopefully using rationality, but at the same time, this organism is producing sounds which are felt. They're felt here. as well as popping out of here, and as well as being filtered through here. And it's the sense of what happens here, which is more important than what happens here and here. Here you can't always control it so well. I've had everyone's story is different. My father grew up in Britain. My mother was Swiss. I grew up in South Africa. To a large extent, I fell between languages, and that's been a blessing rather than a problem. Because instead of being thoroughly soaked in one code, if you have the fortune to have more than one code happening in your brain, so that your brain scrambles every now and again and you don't obey conventional language as per one code, then you've got a better chance of getting something relatively unfiltered coming out from here, from the chest, from the guts, from the heart, from that area. Just by way of random example, I remember one day, at that time being a school teacher before moving into university, I had a particularly troubled and troublesome student. We didn't get on. But I was interested in getting on and finding a better path for both of us. So after a couple of challenges, one day he looked me square in the eye and yelled at me, "I hate your bloody guts." And I remember taking a step backwards and saying, now you've said something real. Now we can actually communicate. What do you want to say from there on? And that, of course, was the beginning of a whole new way of developing a fruitful understanding of what was going on, which was about language in any case. So that's a random example. Again, I don't want to ramble too much, so let's hear you steering this in a better direction.
You're not rambling at all. But of course, the attention that you mentioned, right? Paying attention. I think the words do hold weight in our society, and information and ideas. And when you're talking about editing your poetry, it sounds to me like you're looking to choose the words that that convey the meaning really well, or in a more exact manner.
I think that words, this works in more ways than one. Words have a way of shaping consciousness. And so when you take care with your language, you reshape your consciousness. You fine tune it. Let me try and get at this from another angle. Another very useful learning that I had was listening to a chap who was an editor of poetry. And he would simply hover over someone's poem and mutter about it and say, where is the energy of this going? What is this energy about? Where is the energy of this going? I can see where the energy of this is going. It's going this way. So it was about far more than the words. It was about where the feltness of this is moving, not only the reader to, but moving of itself. Poetry's got its own energy. Once you've finished a poem, once you've satisfied and you're not going to edit it anymore, it's like a painting. It'll carry its own energy, and people will pick up bits and pieces of it. And I think therein lies its value, because it's a kind of a telepathy. Classical poetry retains its appeal from centuries ago. Even poets from way back have a way of conveying something to a present-day reader, which is quite magical. So, in the same sense, when we communicate to each other, even on a very daily or contemporary basis, the poetics of language, that's quite a technical term, but we could say that poetics in itself is a significant part of heart language. Because it's a different experience. When you learn to move away from the babble and get into what wants to be said, what wants to be expressed, sometimes very obvious and very vehement, sometimes very subtle and incredibly valuable. But emerging from the body rather than simply being popped out of the head, that's where the poetry comes into it. And that's where the refinement of language helps us to get to understanding and reading and intuiting what is being said there.
We're discussing poetry which I presume in your conversation about it is written. Yes, you're talking about writing words.
I'm talking more about writing it at the moment than about performing it.
Yes. Yeah, because music is another expression, another language, another type of heart expression, and there are several. So we're talking about poetry. There's also music, and there's also body language, which is also an expression of the heart.
Yes.
Because we're so separate from understanding that all of these arise from the heart. They're all languages of the heart. I believe people have forgotten what's possible.
If I were to try and simplify all that, I would say that the body is always emitting communication, and that poetry is a good way of picking up. Poetry is a good way of sticking out the antenna and picking up what the body is emitting, turning it into words, and then leaving it to see what others make of it.
I'd like to talk for a minute about that in particular, because while these communications are coming from a heart, I believe what's also important is that other hearts experience it. So just to write it in and of itself isn't enough. Just to express it isn't enough. But for it to be heard, for it to be felt, for it to be read by another individual, I think that's significant. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a profound hole in our general system of education, that the ability to communicate at that level, rather than, again, the formal level of dividing the world up into disciplines and subjects, useful, but it doesn't teach you about heart communication. When you speak about hearts being able to listen to each other and hear each other, look, our parents weren't taught that, so they couldn't teach it to us. So it arises spontaneously, and it's often a gift to be able to relate to another human being with such intensity and with such acceptance and with such self-revelation. I'm reminded now of Martin Buber and his book Between Man and Man, and his reference to the I and thou. And this is a wordless scenario that he pictures. Here's someone sitting next to someone else on a bench, and they're not talking. They're not talking at all. There's complete silence. And yet, in the one, something changes, and the other one knows it. And this then is the I and the thou. So if I had to personalize that, in your company, we're saying nothing, but somehow I pick up that this is true about you, and I might not even have to word it, but both of us sense that it's being grasped. Now, I do think that this kind of communicative skill is natural, is good, is healthy for you, and practiced very seldom. Again, animals can do that. The time-honored example that if the lion is fed, the antelope won't run. But if he begins to hunt, the ears go up and the tails twitch and all the antennae go out. And it's not going to be, I'm going to just keep that way, and I'm going to keep that way until the one that is not aware is the one that starts to run too late.
Yes.
Yes. I think that kind of communication is always apparent in boardrooms, in committee meetings. I think the politicians are very skilled at hiding this kind of communication where they intuit it. But you understand, you get the drift.
Yeah.
To go towards a more useful scenario, marriages could fruitfully learn a lot about this kind of communication.
I wondered if you were going to mention that.
It's, yeah, well, any relationship, but in particular, because obviously that's where it counts.
Yeah,
that's where it counts. That's a good starting point. It's a good genesis for children and how they will learn to communicate.
Let's talk a little bit more about heart language and marriage and children when we come back from a short break.
Let's give a shout out to our sponsors. Thank you, We Are Historically, for making this show possible. Shop online at wearehistorically.com.
Hello, I'm Dawn Spiegelberg, a heart coherence coach. How do you feel supported in your life when the rest of the world is anything but supportive to you? It comes from inside. It comes from the foundations that you create day in and day out. The most important thing in understanding how to maintain happiness is the time, because it's the time that you put into maintaining your individual happiness that doesn't just happen overnight. It takes an investment. Live an amazing life and let me help you live that way. Right?
Raise your vibration and energize your life with specialized Fibonacci tuning forks to deepen meditations and empower self-healing. Get your vibrational sound tools for personal enhancement at energybodytuners.com.
Welcome back to the Live by Heart Today show with my guest, Dr. Walter, and we're discussing heart language. And we just began referencing heart language in marriage and how children aren't necessarily learning heart language because parents aren't teaching it, which implies that parents may not be practicing it within their marriage. So I'd like to talk about that. I think based on so many people not having a framework for heart language and not learning it, I think I'm actually privileged to have learned some of it from my father, who spoke very loudly from his heart. And I was fortunate enough to pick up on it at a young age.
Okay, I'm going to speak about the things that I found useful. So I want to tie up these two things. We hear a lot about neuroplasticity. So I want to think about that, and at the same time to think about what this metaphor, or this reality even, but let's treat it as a metaphor first of all, of what the heart is. And I want to try something quite difficult here and refer to the myth of the individual, because we tend to think of my heart being me.
Mm.
But that sense of me can be quite misleading. So I want to suggest that the heart is not an individual me. My heart is a constellation of people, a galaxy of relationships. And so to tie the neuroplasticity back into this, when you were an infant, when you were a toddler, when you're growing up as a child, your brain and your neurons simply learned to mimic what was going on around them. That's the way of it. And that mimicry continues and pops out 30, 40, 50 years later. The word trigger has become commonplace, and one gets triggered by something that the other person does to you. So if we're going to move beyond triggers to reading what the other body is communicating, rather than responding to very small verbal cues, don't use that word to me. Don't use that word to me. And don't use that tone of voice to me. I hate that particular word. Don't call me X, Y, or Z, and don't use that tone of voice to me because it upsets me. And you should know this. So these are all the one-sided triggers talking, and for sure they're natural. They happen. Yeah. No one's going to blame anyone. I want to move away from blame entirely. I learned this about heart language, that when you learn to put your own vehement responses aside and to ask, to be open, what is being communicated here? Not even what is really being communicated here. Get away from the word in the way in which words can mislead, and simply read for what it is. What's happening here? What's being imparted? Where does it come from? And then I think that if you're not liking what's being communicated, you'll soon realize, especially if you're prepared to remove blameworthiness, you will soon realize that this is coming from more than one source. The organism, it sounds pretty cold, but let's just use it. The organism is emitting this communication. It's not the individual trying to be bad. The individual really thinks they're doing their very best, no matter who they are. That's why they are saying these things. That's why they're communicating these things. So if you don't like it, slow down a bit, put on your psychological hat, put on your anthropological hat, put on, or take off all the hats and just pick up what is coming by being more open to it, and less judgmental about it. And I think that will help to discover what a large place the heart is, because there is so much coming from it. Don't reduce it to a particular strand of communication that doesn't suit you.
You're absolutely right. I'm going to jump in and say, what you're describing is how people respond to each other when they're in love. It's not all about them. They're not triggered. They're not taking everything personally. They're not on the defensive all the time. They're open, and they're seeking to connect with the person that they're in love with. And so they are open. They're more neutral, and they're taking in the information in a very different way than when the honeymoon phase is over and somehow they shift out of the we and into the me perspective.
And what I found helpful again here is to think of when you move out of the honeymoon phase, think about holistic communication. The body is one whole thing. So you don't listen to the one or two strands of communication that you think are happening. Again, try and pick up the whole octave of communication, the whole keyboard of communication, not the single note that hammers and doesn't sound great.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me, in thinking about all of the marriage counseling that exists out there, when I've heard people describe, oh, this technique has people do this, like leave notes or, say something nice or have eye contact or, stop and check in for 5 or 10 minutes every day. All of those things are designed to shift you out of the me perspective and to open up the heart and communicate more clearly and openly. And so all that marriage counseling isn't necessarily wrong, but I've never heard marriage counseling talk about the language of the heart in this way. Have you?
Not in particular, no.
Yeah.
No, but again, listening to you, what I would suggest is shifting one's awareness from here to here, and then asking, where is the me? Where is the I here? And then when you get used to the idea that there isn't one, the cosmic heart is here, then it becomes far more possible to pick up that largeness in someone else.
We begin to see what we have in common rather than constantly noticing what's different.
Yeah, for me, it even goes beyond the words of what we've got in common. It's that, well, to use a hackneyed, we are both children of the universe, but I'm trying to get to something which is actually felt in respect of that, rather than just recognized at a verbal level again. Once you feel that you're in the company of this specialness, you develop a whole new respect. And it's that particular place of respect that I think we're not encouraged into. Life is too busy. Life is too rushed. We've got things to do. I'm not going to sit for 5 minutes just looking at you and taking you in. I mean, this is not polite. So,
right.
Again, it's a different way of being with people, and I've had the fortune to meet very, very few people who can do it. They'll just stand there or sit there, take you in, be with you, say very little, but you felt seen, you felt recognized, you felt heard, even if it happens in silence. Yeah. How weird is that? But that's the greatness of it. And I think that when we experience that in a natural context, for instance, we go to a place of remarkable beauty, let's say rivers, waterfalls, mountainscapes, skyscapes, and you simply stand there and take it in. Now, if you do that with another human organism, this is pretty good going, because the other human organism is just as breathtaking as those natural phenomena, even more so. So I've learned to appreciate that.
It certainly isn't rational.
No. That kind of heart language, the heart, I think, is non-rational. The rational language is a brain thing. And it's how we've learned to communicate with each other using coded sounds, which then have become written, thanks to the alphabet and the printing press. But the heart simply emits, and I think it emits feelings, and they can be very quick or very slow, thinking fast, thinking slow. But it emits, and when you take the time, literally, when you take the time to pick up what is being emitted, you will learn. You will learn incrementally and exponentially.
We have just a few minutes left, and I'd like to talk a little more about how the heart language is not rational, so it's not head-based, and how one might become comfortable with the irrationality of it, because you and I have had conversations with dramatic pauses, and I don't find that uncomfortable. And I know there are many, many people who cannot sit with empty space, empty of words. What do you recommend to them?
Okay. I'd recommend that we use the word non-rational rather than irrational when it comes to the heart.
Thank you.
Because what the heart intends, I think, is entirely rational, but it's a whole different level of rationality. Because who can tell why or how the intention arises? We can say more about that later. But the heart does intend, and I think sometimes more consciously, sometimes less consciously. But the intention is entirely understandable, often not reasonable, and definitely not always pin downable. To say, in that sense, you could say irrational. But I don't think that. I think that it's not unreadable. It's not indecipherable. It's not unscrutable. It's not as mystical as we would sometimes suppose it to be. The human heart and human intention have a very close way of overlapping, and that bears some discussion. But you asked something which I want to go back to.
I asked what you would suggest someone do who is uncomfortable in experiencing the language of the heart, which can occur during silences. People can take in a mountain, people can take in, beautiful scenery and enjoy it and really experience it, but they're not comfortable enjoying or experiencing another individual.
Okay, then I would suggest they begin with themselves and find out how comfortable they are with their own vividly felt silent presence. And to try and practicalize that, I would say, see for how long you can sit down with nothing in front of you, so that you are just sitting down with yourself. Maybe a cup of coffee is okay, or a glass of water. And simply be with yourself and notice again for how long you can do that and be comfortable. Maybe 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. What are your thoughts doing? What are your feelings doing? What is your body doing? Are you getting irritated or distracted yet? Or can you find you have to create the peace, or is it naturally there? Are you happy to treat yourself with reverence? Does it come naturally? Those kinds of questions. And I think that the more you become attuned to being in harmony, to being able to resonate as yourself, the more you will find the ability to enjoy that same sort of peacefulness, that same sort of resonance with others.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for that. I so appreciate having you as my guest today, Dr. Walter, and thank you to everyone who was with us watching today. Please let us know that you've been watching. We want to hear from you. So tell us what's on your heart by leaving us a comment. For more information about how you can live by heart, please go to livebyhearttoday.com. Like and follow this page and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our programs. We are here Thursdays at 4:44 Pacific time. From our heart to yours, we're creating a better tomorrow because we live by heart today.
And that concludes this portion of Live by Heart Today.
And thank you to our sponsors for making the show possible. Hooray! Thank you, We Are Historically, for your conscious human apparel. Shop online at wearehistorically.com.
Level up your life and raise your vibration with specialized Fibonacci tuning forks. Get your vibrational sound tools for your personal enhancement at energybodytuners.com.
Thank you for joining us. Have a happy always. View more episodes on our website.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about that. And I'm trying to think of ways to make it practical.